Hi, my name is Hulda Schultz, and today I will be presenting on aspects of social influence as discussed this week in our textbook readings. For this presentation, I wanted to cover the social psychology topics of conformity, compliance, obedience, groups, and de-individuation. Social influence looks at how behavior changes around others. A person may do something to please a group of people that they would not normally do if by themselves. Conformity explores how people change behaviors to reflect group norms as set in that social group. Compliance is changing behavior due to a direct request from someone else, usually a request that is phrased in a roundabout way, such as, "Hey, will you do me a favor?" In contrast, obedience is a change of behavior due to a direct request, usually involving an authoritative figure. Your mom does not ask a favor, she tells you to do something and you do it. Groups are a set of individuals who conform to group norms, and so on. Groups can be divided into in-groups and out-groups. In-groups being the group that you identify with, and out-groups being a group of people you do not identify with, as we have looked at in previous weeks. De-individuation is the loss of a person's individuality and constraints against deviant behavior due to the influence of another group. So, mobs. A person loses their individuality and sense of morals when they are in the presence of a large, excited group of people and thus do things that they would not normally do. Looking at this more in depth, let's first look at conformity. Kaysen, Fenn, and Marcus define conformity as a person's tendency to change their behaviors and beliefs to conform to group norms. Conformity is not always obvious. It can be anywhere from a complete giving up of beliefs in order to please the group to simply dressing a certain way because of how other people in that group are dressing, such as going out in public wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of going out in your bathroom. People may conform due to a need to be right, thus following what everyone else sees as right, or potentially out of fear, as explained in our textbook by Kaysen. Conformity is not always obvious, and as just stated, there are different reasons for it. People also conform even if another is obviously wrong, as discussed in Zolman's article. Private conformity is true change within a person, not just outward behavior. In other words, conformity and change in your thoughts and attitudes and what you believe, and which is thus reflected in your behavior. Public conformity is changing outward behaviors without believing anything from within. So outwardly you do the behaviors even if inwardly you believe and feel something different, as explained in our textbook. As one of the questions I wanted to ask for this presentation, and that will be covered later in the PowerPoint, is, as Christians, how should we look on conformity? Do we conform to social norms, or should we stand against them? I wanted to bring that up now simply because we have just gone over what conformity is, but we will readdress that later on. Compliance is defined as changes in behavior that are elicited by direct requests, as defined by Kaysen, Fenn, and Marcus. People can get one another to comply with simple questions, or by phrasing things in an inviting way. What I think of when I think of compliance is the story of Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer tricked his friends into painting a picket fence for him by acting like it was fun. And in the end, Tom Sawyer ended up with a bunch of gifts because kids would give him things in order for him to allow them to paint the fence. Different methods for compliance are the foot and door technique, lowballing, the door in the face, and several others. When tricked into compliance, people often feel cheated and annoyed. The norm of reciprocity states that people will treat a person based on how that person treated them, which is another type of compliance. So if a person gives you candy, you may thus feel obligated to comply and return the favor, giving them a piece of candy when you next have spares. Obedience is behavior change produced by authority. One example that Case and Fenn and Marcus brought up in our textbook was Hitler and the Nazis. When asked for the reasons that they did the terrible things they did, Nazis often say, because we were told to. That is what they were commanded to do by their authority figure. A classic example in psychology is Milgram's shock experiment, where participants were asked to shock another person. I believe the person being shocked was called Mr. Wilson. The higher the shock, the louder Mr. Wilson screamed, and yet the experimenter kept telling the participant to continue shocking. Now, Mr. Wilson was never actually shocked, but it was surprising the amount that a person would obey simply because the experimenter was an authority figure. The appearance of authority figure affects obedience. Case and Fenn and Marcus covered how in Milgram's shock experiment, when they moved the experiment from a university room where the experimenter was dressed in a lab coat to a little rundown office, people were far less likely to go through with the terrible thing and continue shocking Mr. Wilson. Two different figures that can be present in obedience are the transmitter and executant. The transmitter is the middleman who takes the command from the authority figure and gives it to the executant. It was found that transmitters were 54% more obedient than executants because they were not required to go through with the procedure, as explained by Case and Fenn and Marcus on page 297. Groups are a set of individuals who share goals or interests and interact together over time. Groups have roles, norms, and cohesiveness. Roles are a person's expected role within the group, such as, well, he's the joker of the group, he's the funny one. Norms are the rules of conduct for members that they are expected to follow, and cohesiveness brings group members closer together. For instance, research done by Carter Reese and Danielle Wallace in 2014 found that adolescents will conform to the group norm and drink if that is what their peers are doing. The stereotype of group divisions in schools are due to the presence of groups. Leslie Howley, Harmon Hosch, and James Bovaird in 2014 discussed how athletes in school exhibit in-group bias, favoring members of their own group over others. There are two types of groups. In-groups are the group with which a person feels a sense of belonging to. It can be political, competitive, or friends. Out-groups are a group of individuals to which a person does not belong to. They are often dehumanized by in-groups in order to feel better. Another question I wanted to discuss in this presentation that I will bring up now before covering later on is considering in-group bias. What is the likelihood for a person to conform to out-group norms when his or her in-group is not around to see? De-individuation is the loss of a person's individuality and constraints against deviant behavior in the presence of a group. It is caused by arousal, anonymity, and a decreased sense of responsibility. It can occur because of happiness or because of depression. When sports teams win, fans will riot in the streets and cause destruction due to joy, not just because of depression. The win is the cause of arousal. The large group of fans causes feelings of anonymity, and many factors can contribute to the loss of responsibility. Accountability cues help the individual determine how accountable they will be for their behavior within the group. If accountability is low, they are more likely to release the constraints of morals and do bad things. Attentional cues focus a person's attention away from the self. Individuals become less attentive to the inner self and long-term consequences in the presence of the large group and will more likely do bad things. Social identity model of de-individuation effects, or SIDE, is the theory of how individuation works. It explains group behavior and de-individuation effects as a result of a shift from personal identity to social identity. So the two questions I wanted to cover after our discussion are, as Christians, how should we view conformity? Do we conform to social norms in this world, or are we to stand against them? And secondly, considering in-group bias, what is the likelihood for a person to conform to out-group norms when his or her in-group is not around to see? Thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful.